Hi, everyone. So I'm here together with my colleague Lucas, who's back, to talk about research environment from the UK Research Excellence Framework. Before I start, I just want to mention that part of this project was done while I was working for Research England, who organizes this Research Excellence Framework that I'll talk about. But my conclusions are independent from Research England. I'm here as a researcher. This. Ah. All right. Okay. So, what is the Research Excellence Framework? I assume that in the US, a lot of you are having a big question mark. You don't really understand what I'm talking about. So, the Research Excellence Framework, or as we know it, the REF in the UK, is a big, it's often qualified as one of the biggest peer review exercise in the world. It's a big peer review exercise that is done nationally throughout the UK to assess research institution and distribute money. So it's responsible for distributing a bit over £2 million a year to these research institutions. It's repeated every 7 or 8 years, and it's looking at different elements of these research institutions. It's going to look at outputs. It's going to look at research impact, so how the research is put into impact, and it's going to look at the environment that is in place, the research environment that's in place in these institutions. As you can see, there's percentages, and they're changing year after year. This year, there's a bit of a debate happening right now, so if you're curious, you can look at the news in the UK. There's a new article happening this morning. So the percentages are changing a little bit, but what's important to note is that research environment, or for this year, people, culture, and environment, is increasing in percentage. That means that there's more money in the money distributed that is based on the environments in place in research institutions. So because of that increased percentage, that raised a real need to have good indicators for research environment. There's been some work happening before my own analysis. So there's the UK Forum for Responsible Research Metrics that has done some work before the 2021 REF. There's some work happening at the moment that has been commissioned in 2023, and the work that I'm presenting now is a bit in the middle. So I started the work as a senior policy advisor at Research England, informed by the Forum for Responsible Research Metrics, and my results were used for the commission from 2023, but I finalized it as a researcher at Manchester. So how is that little percentage of research environment assessed in the REF? Well, I won't bore you with the details. You can ask questions. It's a bit more complex than what I say. But in short, each research institution submits one institutional environment statement and different unit level, or if you want discipline level, environment statements. There's 34 different units. You can see in the appendix the ones that I selected and which institutions. But these statements then have different context, different elements. They talk about the unit context and structures, the people, the infrastructures and facilities, and the collaboration and contribution to the research-based economy and society. So what I did for this project was I randomly selected 34 research environment statements at the unit level. So I used one for each unit to see the diversity, because there's very different units, for example, arts or mathematics. So I wanted to see the diversity in that. I selected statements that had 4 stars, so they were the highest graded. And I looked at the entire statement, mostly focusing on the people, but looking at the entire thing. I did that manually by coding the statements in vivo through a qualitative analysis, first inductive and then deductive with induction when I needed. And I complemented my findings with other documents and guidance that exist. So the full results are very boring and very long. So I will not bore you with that. But I just want to say that I found indicators that were, well, that related to people, to culture, and to environment. And in each of these elements, I found little indicators. Sometimes they were metrics, sometimes they were things that institutions are doing to prove that they have good research environment. And I grouped those into subgroups that I then group into groups, and my final results look like this. So it's a lot of little text separated by semicolons, and these are all indicators. If you want to have a look at the full results, feel free to. There's a QR code here. But I just wanted to focus on 5 interesting findings that I found from that research here. So the first point that I noticed is that, so I did this inductively without knowing the guidance. So I had just started at Research England. I didn't know exactly what institutions were asked to do. I coded inductively. And what I found was that what I found was actually really, really similar to what institutions were asked. Okay, like not too surprising, but at the same time, in the guidance, they do say, don't use this as a checklist and don't limit yourself to this. But what I saw was that most institutions used the guidance as a checklist. Another element that I found that I thought was interesting comes from the fact that I use unit level or discipline level statements. I found that there's quite different concepts of, different expressions of core concepts of research. And I'll just show you 2 examples. So for example, there were diverse interpretations of research integrity. And I found that interesting. So for example, in one unit, people mentioned that it's important for research integrity to understand the provenance of objects of antiquity. That was an arts unit, so that's not something you often hear about in research integrity, and to prevent illicit import. There was another unit in social studies that talked about the importance of protecting vulnerable people and sensitive material, but also the duty of institution to protect their researchers as a duty of care. And that was part of research integrity, and I found that quite interesting. I also found the diverse interpretations of open access. So there's a whole element asking about open access, and institutions say how they fulfill that. But there were some units that worked with other countries or with populations that do not speak English that really stress the importance of languages and translations as an important access element. And that's not always something that we hear from. There was another group talking about the importance of repatriating recordings and documents and whatever, like the output of their research, their papers, they wanted to bring them to the libraries and the local population. A third point that I found quite interesting is that, of course, there's a lot of quantitative and qualitative indicators. It's important, I think, at this level, at a university level, to have some quantitative indicators as a form of evidence. But quite often, the qualitative indicators were really important to add context of what the university value. And here I just gave you 2 examples that we're talking about sabbatical leave and research leave. This example talks about how sabbatical leave was really useful in promoting the research and the impact of the research in their university. But this other statement actually goes a bit beyond that, talking about personal values of one of their researchers who wanted to reconnect their family to, like their young family to the grandparents. And that's a bit more personal. So you see that without the qualitative information, we wouldn't have that information. The 4th point that I wanted to mention that I found quite interesting is on EDI. We've already discussed a bit of that. But what I noticed in the statements is that the discussion on EDI was really focused on gender parity. So there was really a lot of discussion on gender and on the overall balance in the unit. So how many males are there? How many females are there? There was less on ethnicity, disability, nationality, sexuality, age. These things were less discussed. They were discussed, but not in all statements. Fewer statements were talking about the balance for different positions and seniority. Very few talked about pay gap, and that was a point that was mentioned in the guidance, so that was surprising. And then there was one statement, only one, that talked about the added burden of disparity and what it can have as a burden on individuals. So I found that quite interesting. And now the last point that I found interesting to mention is that in reading the statements, I also noticed there are a few voices that are missing. The first one is they talked a lot about how they support researchers, but very few were talking about research enabling staff or research technicians. That is likely to change in Ref 2029 because there's huge discussions on that aspect, but I thought it was quite surprising that it was almost never mentioned. And finally, I noticed that there were voices that were always missing. That's not very surprising, but that's still a point that I think it's important to remember. So all the people who left academia for a reason or another, their voices were not heard. They were not. The support to them was completely missing in the statements. And so maybe my idea is that maybe these voices need to be captured more in meta research projects or in the projects that we're doing. So that's it. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Noemi and her very interesting presentation?
I'm sorry if the ref is a bit of a difficult topic to introduce in 10 minutes.
Maybe somebody can share their experience. Okay, wait a second. Let me see if we give it something from, okay, Anna. Go ahead.
Anna Marušić, Croatia. Thank you very much. This a very extensive qualitative study. I wonder the relationship between culture and environment. This culture is values, environment is putting that in practice. Did you see, I mean, do they specifically say in their guidance about culture or climate or environment, and how to, how to get some kind of recommendations about that from
Yeah, you mean so the distinction between culture and environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and whether they address it, and what would your recommendations would be based on your identification of these criteria or elements that are related to culture and environment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I have to say, and I'm going back in my slides just to show you a bit. So in the ref, this element was always called research environment statement. It was never called culture, people, culture, and environment until this year. So that was a decision that was made by the team from the Metric Tide. So they did a revision of the ref 2021, and they decided to make it like the trio of people, but also the culture and the environment. And in discussion with them, I had to in discussion with them and the team at UKRI, I had to identify what was a research culture, what was a research environment. And the way I organize it here is mostly that the culture is really how the research is performed, for example, the responsible research practices that are in place, who are the people who are doing the research, what kind of collaborative culture or competitive culture there is, versus the environment that I put more as the formal support that is in place. In terms of recommendations, well, I think from what I saw from the statement, it really does cover a lot of ground. So there's really a lot that is covered. But like I mentioned, the research technicians and research support staff were not included. So I think to have a full picture of the research culture, I would really stress that we need to look beyond the researchers. And that's an element that I really noticed was missing. For the environment, there's a lot of focus on financial support and maybe a bit on well-being and like work-life balance, but not that much. It's really more focused on we give grants, we give funding. So I think focusing also on the individual aspect and their voices in shaping the culture itself, in shaping the environment itself, would be important to add a bit more.
Thank you. We'll take a question in the back and then we'll go to you.
Hello, thanks for your presentation. Chris Winchester from Oxford Pharmagenesis. You mentioned that there was a diversity of views on open access, and I was from the researchers, and I wondered what publishers and others in the room can learn from what do researchers need from publishers in terms of accessibility or plain language summaries or other things that can improve the utility and accessibility of research.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have to say, because the statements were really addressing the like how wonderful the environment was within the institution, they rarely ever talked about the publishers. They just said, okay, we provide like funding for open access, we provide like this percentage of our publications were open access and etc. And then there were some who had differences of opinions in what open access really meant. Some who also mixed open research and open access. And so I think, well, in terms of direct recommendations for publishers, I'm not sure you would find them in that. I'm not sure you would find them in these statements, but I think what's relevant to find from the statements is really the richness of how different disciplines are using open access, how they criticize it, and my colleague will talk a bit about that on Friday as well, but how they are, how the different units, so there were, for example, architecture and arts. For them, open access doesn't mean just opening a paper. It was also about opening the artifacts, the physical things that they find and that they study, opening access to people to go study these things. So I think it goes even beyond the publishers. That's what I mean. Maybe having, because we have the technology, having more like 3D modelization to open these kind of things, that could be something that could be interesting to have more data sharing. But yeah, I should probably stop there because there was no clear.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Noemi. This is really fascinating material. I'd love to read your paper, and I took the QR code already. My question is about the background of the whole thing. Am I right that you are suggesting that these statements are self-reports from universities?
Yes.
And I happen to know how these self-reports are made.
Yes.
And I'm not saying people are lying, but sometimes they're making stuff a little bit more beautiful, especially when you invite them to write tear-jerking passages on paper. So my question is, does anyone validate this stuff? Do they go out and talk to the workers in these universities? Do they check some numbers? Or these are easily to check, but what is there in the domain of validation of the whole thing? Because
I was going to ask the exact same thing if there were no more questions.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. That's also why this work happened, because while I was working at Research England, I read the criticism that people had from Ref 2021, and a lot of people say environment statements are just like, yeah, they're just a fluffy paper that people show off everything they have and they don't mention everything they don't have. So that's why there's the motivation to identify indicators, identify things that people are obliged to report. You saw that I mentioned the pay gap was only reported in 4 statements. I reviewed 34. So most of them don't mention that. Why? Maybe because there's a problem there. So the idea from Research England initially was to have a questionnaire style instead of a statement, so that you would have these indicators that are really important. But then there's sensibilities, because a good environment in one unit is not the same as in another unit. It's not the same as in another university. So they want to leave freedom in there. So I agree with you, and it's a huge criticism of Ref 2021. But that's also why there's this work happening, and especially the commission. They're piloting now the review of research environment statements. They're piloting how these statements can be graded, like comparing scoring, comparing the peer review process. And I think they're going to come up with some very interesting findings, but that's just going to come at the end of the year, I believe.
thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions, so we'll go with you and then with you.
Hi, Robert Thibault, Coalition for Aligning Science. I'm wondering, when you look through all of these documents, were any of them outlining different team structures rather than just having researchers at different ranks, but actually having specialization in terms of data managers or project managers, software engineers, to make for a more conducive environment to impactful research, and whether the ref cares or is looking into those types of things?
Yeah, that was not as visible as I had expected, actually. They mention mostly like the different seniorities of researchers and then how they're supported, how they're working, how they interact with each other. But as I mentioned, like research technicians and what we call research enabling staff were often forgotten. So the statisticians, even the grant managers, the people who are not like a PI were often missed. But then they had a whole section at the end on collaboration. Most of them talked about collaboration with other universities, but some of them were really focusing on collaboration within the unit and within that university. So in that sense, you were able to identify things. And the other element was really just sometimes they spoke about the rooms and how they're organized so that people can talk to each other and build groups. And then they talked about the impact that each group had in research or on society. And then you see a bit more of the structure, but they just list initials and names without saying much more.
Hi, James Dumlau, University of Michigan. Thank you for your presentation. Is it correct that you were analyzing only like the 4-star, like the successful statements? Okay. And do you have a sense that like the ref is understood as a competition for funding among institutions? Like super, right? Okay. So would you interpret your results as like strategic behavior in particular? So like, for example, you're finding that like they're sticking to official guidelines as a checklist. Like, would you interpret that as like a best practice for institutions? Did you compare like, did you like look at any non-successful statements?
Yeah, so I did not because it's very tedious to study those, and the idea was to get like indicators of good research environment. So that's why we chose the 4-star. But you raise a very good point, and just to show an example based on what you're saying. So I was a policy advisor at Research England, so I had like the mandates to try to reform the REF, to do the REF 2029, I understand what would help research institutions have good research environment to support the researchers. And now, when I moved to a research institution, I understood just how strategic it is. People start having meetings to understand how they're going to boost their scores, and they keep that hidden from other institutions. So it's extremely competitive, extremely strategic. But that's not what the team that's organizing the exercise wants. And they even try to find ways to reduce that competition and that strategy building, but it's not really working. And just an example, so you saw I showed the percentage for the next ref for 2029 that they're changing, and that's in the news right now. That's because the institutions are, well, first they don't have, there's big funding cuts, and that was a big reason. But the other reason is because the guidance is not out yet. And the institutions are very worried that they will not have the support in place that's going to be in the final guidance. Whereas it shouldn't be that because it's in the guidance, that's why you do it. But this is sort of an interpretation of things because in the end, it's a big chunk of funding for each institution. So yeah.